Welcome everyone to Hadran's Complete Beginner's Guide to Gemara, Part 3, with the wonderful Rabbanit Leah Sarna. Um, Her job has changed somewhat if you've seen her previous series of the Beginner's Guide. She is currently the spiritual leader of Keilat Shari Torah, an Orthodox synagogue in Lower Merion, Pennsylvania. And she's on the faculties of the Drisha Institute for Jewish Education and the International Day team. And she obviously is an integral part of Hadran and our beginners space. And we're very happy to see all of you and so many of you here today. And however many of you will be joining us online as well. Welcome to the series. If this is your first year, if this is your first class, don't worry, totally fine. You are very welcome here, and we're very happy to see you here. So we'll hand it over to you, Rabbanit Leah Sarna.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Maggie. Welcome back, everyone who I've had the privilege of learning with before. Welcome to all the new people. Don't worry, you can start from here. And after these 3 sessions, if you're like, wait, I want more, lucky you. You can go on the Hadran website, and we've done 2 previous series of these, and this is not really going to overlap with that so much. I mean, obviously, it's all the Gemara, and what is Gemara if not tons of interwoven ideas? But we're doing new stuff this time, and it's very, very fundamental stuff. There's just a lot. Anyone who's ever tried to learn Gemara knows there's like a lot of fundamental stuff. So we are not running out of material for beginner's guide anytime soon. But this time in this series, we're going to focus on how the logic works, which is, I think, a different entree into it than what we've done before. So the previous 2 series were very much like history. What is this text? How does the page work? Stuff like that. Last time we also did like, how do we get to halacha from this? Like, how does anyone live based on this super complicated multivocal text? So that was good fun. Also, definitely check that out. And this time we're just going to be deep inside the multivocality of the Talmud. We have 3 different sessions, and I'm really excited to dive into this with you. One piece of housekeeping. So I'm going to talk for about 45, 50 minutes. If you have questions that come up during that time, you can write them down. You can put them in the chat, but I'm not going to look at the chat until the end. So in that last 10, 15 minutes, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll open up the chat. And the most useful thing for me to do would be if you, at that point, put all your questions into the chat, and I'll get through as many as I can in the remaining time. And if you have way more questions than I get to, that's obviously amazing. And you can save questions for next week, or you can be in touch with me outside of this. And there's also a WhatsApp group and things like that that people can participate in and find me through. So um that was just by means of housekeeping. So I think people probably have to stay muted, but we're not going to be taking like verbal spoken questions at any point in this class, just for kind of like ease and speed. And so yeah, we're just doing written questions that will be in the chat at the end. And I'll remind you about that when we get to it. Okay. Oh, and you could also just bear in mind this is recorded and it's going to go on the internet so that lots of people can reference it in the future. All the previous series people have really made good use of long after the live recordings of them, which is obviously such an amazing thing that Hadron provides. And if you haven't spent deep time in the Hadron website, I just really want to recommend it. They invest in it really heavily, and it really pays off for learners, just how user-friendly their website is. And in addition, over the course of this week, there's going to be a quiz that'll go up there just for funsies. I don't sit there and grade them. You're not going to, I'm around a I'm not her level. I'm not sending you back a handwritten anything. But it'll be a way to kind of review the material we've done so far. And with this material, that's actually really good because sometimes you think you got it, and then you just need to like keep working at it a few times, do a few different, like with any logic class. I don't know who else. I took a bunch of logic classes when I was an undergrad, and you like have a concept in your head, but you have to like apply it a bunch of times until you really have it down. So we're gonna hopefully provide a quiz that people can do that with for this material as well. And hopefully that will help solidify the learning also that we're doing together. All right, so now I have a slideshow, just so you know. So I'm going to share my screen. There's me like my face, loads of other people's faces, and then also a slide. So you can do a few things. You're in charge of whose face is all you see. So there's going to be a thing in the top right corner, and you'll have options to say, I just want to see like the speaker's face, for example. You might want to choose that. Or you might want to look at everyone else's faces, totally up to you. And then there's also a slider. So you can say, oh, I want the slide to take up 75% of my screen. I want it to be 50% of my screen. You can move that back and forth. Some of my slides have a lot of text on them. I'll be mostly reading all of it out loud. But if you want to be able to like really read it, you can slide it over so you don't see anyone's face. Like you're actually in charge. Zoom is really great these days for this type of thing. So just so you know what all the options are. All right, here we go. Okay. So lesson number one is called hermeneutic logic, from Torah to law. So a hermeneutic would be how do we derive something from a Torah text? How do we learn something out from a Torah text? Okay, and this now needs to change slides. Here we go. So how are legal teachings derived from Torah texts? It's actually kind of two separate questions. So question number one is, if a Torah text is ambiguous or contains ambiguity within it, how do you know what's the right way to read that text? A. And then B, if a law doesn't seem to be explicitly in the Torah, how can you learn it out from the Torah? And so we're going to actually see a we're going to focus today on three different hermeneutic principles. If when the Torah text is ambiguous, how can you know which is the correct way to read it? Klal Uprat, which is the third principle we're going to be spending time on today, is really all about that. And the first two, Kal V'chomer and Gzera Shava, are really about the second question here. If a law doesn't seem to be explicitly in the Torah, how can you derive it? But these are still interpretive questions, right? Which is what hermeneutics are about. And Tanaim and Amorim just have a big diversity of approaches to this question. And there's two main schools of thought that scholars have identified. And those are the school of Rabbi Ishmael and the school of Rabbi Akiva. So we might be familiar with the school of Rabbi Akiva from this quite famous story about Rabbi Akiva. So we have the story that Rav Yehuda teaches in the name of Rav. And he says, Moshe Rabbeinu ascends on high to receive the Torah. B'sha'ah she'ala Moshe lemarom. Matza'ola Kadosh Baruch Hu sheyoshev v'kosher ktarim la'otiyot. He sees HaKadosh Baruch Hu sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. So what we're talking about here, if you've ever seen a Torah inside, is that the letters have tagin. They have little crowns on them. So you might have like a certain letter, and then it'll have like a little like chupchik on the top of it. And that's what we're talking about here. And you see Moshe going up and saying, well, like I didn't need the crowns on that letter. Why is that on here? And why is Hashem spending the extra time tying those little crowns onto the letters? And so Moshe says, Amar lefanav Ribbono shel olam, Moshe says to the master of the world, Mima akiv al yadacha, who's holding you up? Why are you spending the time to do this? Who's holding back your hand from giving me the Torah, as it is, without all of these extra little crowns? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says back to Moshe, Adam echad yesh she'atid liot b'sof kama dorot. There's a man and he's going to live in many generations. Ve'akiva ben Yosef Shmo, and his name is Akiva, son of Yosef, i.e. Rabbi Akiva, she'atid lidrosh al kol kotes v'kotes, who is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns, tilin shal halachot, mounds and mounds of halachot. So the crowns are tied onto the Torah so that Rabbi Akiva can darshan them, which is kind of a wild idea that like, oh, these crowns wouldn't have been needed if not for Rabbi Akiva. And it's also the case that what that represents about the school of Rabbi Akiva is that they will learn from anything, even a crown on a letter. That's where they'll find hermeneutic or potentially legal midrashic meaning. And that'll make more sense when we compare Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Ishmael. So Rabbi Ishmael, those of you, maybe if you've said Kaddish and you've gotten to shul right on time, you might be familiar with this Breita de Rabbi Ishmael. So this appears in the Siddur, and then, or in Siddur Ashkenaz at least, and then right after it, you say a Kaddish Rabbanan, and then you start Psukei de Zimra from there. So that's why people might be familiar with it. So Rabbi Ishmael, we're not going to go through all of these, but he in this Sifra, so what is the Sifra, by the way? Sifra is a work of Midrash Halacha. It is not technically in the Gemara, even though our tradition sees it as Gemara, and it's actually brought at that point of our like Shachari service, or morning service, not Shachari yet, pre-Psukei de Zimra service, as Gemara, and we can talk about that part of the Siddur a different time, but it's brought as Gemara. So our tradition in some ways sees it as Gemara, but when the Daf Yomi cycle was invented, or when the Shas is printed, the Sifra is not included in that. It's not like a Masachet of Gemara or anything like that. Actually, in previous sessions, we've talked about Midrash Halacha more specifically, so you can look back there, you'll find more about the Sifra. But in any event, it contains this text, which is a list of Rabbi Ishmael's 13 methods, 13 hermeneutic principles, or the Torah is expounded through 13 methods. And here you have these very specific rules. We're going to look at a few of them today. You can see, right? Kal v'chomer, gzera shava, binyan av igatu v'echad, binyan av mishnik tuvim, klal uprat, prat uklal, klal uprat uklal, right? All these different ideas. We're just going to see a small handful of them today. But these are very strict, and there's like rules, and there's this is how this works, and da da da. It's not like, oh, this letter has a crown on it. Let me interpret something based on that. It's like these are all based on rules, and they're based on principles, and there's only a set number of them, and it's all very strict. So just to give you a sense, you could spend a very long time and take multiple classes and read books and articles about these like schools, and some people think that schools are less strict than I'm kind of presenting here, and some people think they're more strict and whatever. But if you spend time with Midrash Halacha, you get a feeling that the ones that scholars attribute to Rabbi Ishmael's school and the ones that scholars attribute to Rabbi Akiva's school are operating on different sets of hermeneutic principles. And this is just like a little bit of a foray into why you might get that feeling, and that Rabbi Ishmael has these very much stricter rules. Rabbi Akiva accepts Rabbi Ishmael's rules, but also is open to lots of other things, and also will sometimes use different terms for things, which we'll maybe talk about a little bit later today. Okay, so our first one that we're going to talk about together is Kal v'chomer. And the reason why we have to start with Kal v'chomer is because Kal v'chomer is the most important of any of these tools, and it is the most important type of logic, I would argue, that appears in all of Jewish literature. Kal v'chomer is still used today. When you read responsa literature about modern questions, Kal v'chomer is a type of logical reasoning that is foundational to everything, which means that we have to have a really good handle on how Kal v'chomer works, what are the principles and rules and logical rules that surround it. So that is where we are starting, and we're going to be spending the majority of our time today on Kal v'chomer. Okay. So one of the ways that you know that Kal v'chomer is really important is because it's actually also known as a din, which is amazing. Like, you thought that a din was like a psak halacha, or like a ruling or a halacha. Some of you might have had classes in elementary school and high school called dinim. I certainly did. And when you took your dinim class, it did not include kal v'chomer. But in fact, the Gemara not infrequently refers to kal v'chomer as a din. We're going to see a principle that relates to kal v'chomer later on in a couple of slides. And it's going to refer to the logical principle of kal v'chomer as din. And there's a few of those. So I didn't put this in because it's a little bit complicated, but we have an idea of ein onshin min hadin. We don't punish based on kal v'chomer arguments. So in that phrase, which is foundational to Masachet Makod and a few others, you are referring to kal v'chomer and things learned out via kal v'chomer as din. So the word din, because of this, becomes a confusing word because sometimes it just means this is the rule, this is the decision. But within the Gemara, more times than not, I think it refers to something learned out by kal v'chomer. Okay, so when we're thinking about how foundational is kal v'chomer, just think for a moment that things learned out via kal v'chomer are called din. They're just called the law. That's how essential and important and heavyweight kal v'chomer learnings are. In Latin, kal v'chomer is called a fortiori, so fort from like strength, right? The stronger one. It's one of those terms like phylacteries that doesn't actually help anyone. The only thing a fortiori means is kal v'chomer. But sometimes people use it and they'll put it in translations as if you're supposed to know what it means and as if it helps anyone. So now you know when you see a fortiori, what it means is kal v'chomer. And now we're going to learn what a kal v'chomer is. Okay. So we're going to start with some rules about sneakers and snow boots, okay? Just to give us a sense, these are not in the Gemara. Okay, so kal v'chomer can be used to learn both rules that are prohibitive and rules that are permissive. And they get used in opposite direction, right? The logic moves in opposite directions depending on whether you're prohibiting or permitting. Okay. So let's start with a prohibition example. If it is against the rules to wear sneakers inside, kal v'chomer, it is against the rules to wear snow boots inside. So that's a prohibition example. If the lenient case, the sneakers case, is prohibited, then surely the chomer, the stricter case, is also prohibited, i.e., snow boots. Okay, so the lenient case is prohibited, kal v'chomer, the strict case is prohibited. So the kal in any kal v'chomer, you want to be able to identify what is my lenient, what is my strict. Lenient is sneakers, strict is snow boots. Kal is sneakers, chomer is snow boots. Okay, so when we're learning about a prohibition that applies to the kal is going to apply to the chomer. I'll say that again. A prohibition that applies to the kal is going to then apply to the chomer. Okay, let's move on to a permission example. If it is permitted to wear snow boots inside, kal v'chomer, it is permitted to wear sneakers inside. So again, the kal is the sneakers, the chomer is the strict. But in a permission example, if something is permitted in the strict case, then surely kal v'chomer, it would be permitted in the lenient case. So in a permission example, you're going to want to start with your strict case and move to your lenient case. That's the opposite direction as in a prohibition example. In a prohibition, you're going to start with your lenient case. Something that's prohibited in the lenient case will surely be prohibited in the strict case. And in a permission example, something that's permitted in the strict case will then surely be permitted in the lenient case. So if it's permitted to wear snow boots inside, surely it's permitted to wear sneakers inside. If it's prohibited to wear sneakers inside, surely it's prohibited to wear snow boots inside. Okay, I know we were just talking about sneakers and snow boots, but I feel like already that's probably like a lot of material and pretty confusing. So we're gonna do a bunch of more cases and you're gonna see that the applications are even broader than what we brought here just now. But in all cases, right, you want to figure out, are we learning from the Kal to the Homer or from the Homer to the Kal? What in this case is the Kal and what in this case is the Homer. And once you've figured out those two, right, the directionality of the learning and what is the Kal and what is the Homer, you're in good shape towards figuring out how your Kal V'chomer is working. So again, which direction is the learning going in? And then also like what's my Kal and what's my Homer? What's my lenient case and what's my strict case? Okay. The other language, there's a lot of language for Kal V'chomer, like they say, like they have a lot of words for love in French, a lot of words for snow in like Arctic communities. And in the Talmud, we have a lot of words for Kal V'chomer. So we have already seen Kal V'chomer din. The other words that are very common are kol shekain and al achat kama v'chama. How much more so? Okay. So how much more so is just another articulation of Kal V'chomer. It's the same thing, operates by the same rules. It's just different language. And you'll see that all over the place and you'll see them together. Like we'll say, oh, we're going to learn it by Kal V'chomer. And then as they're teaching out the Kal V'chomer, they'll say this blah, 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 kol shekain, how much more so. So the Gemara internally knows that this is the same language for the same thing. We just have a lot of language that all kind of revolves around the same logical principle. So just as an example of a how much more so, or a kol shekain, or an al achat kama v'chama, if it's prohibited to wear sneakers inside, how much more so would it be prohibited to wear snow boots inside? So it's not kal v'chomer, it would be prohibited to wear snow boots inside. It's how much more so would it be prohibited to wear snow boots inside, but it's working in the same way as the previous slide. All right, so we're just going to bring two examples. And what's interesting kind of about these examples is this one in particular, the next one is much more explicitly halachic. This one, you're sort of like, oh, that feels like a value instead of a din or like a halacha, in particular because it comes from Pirkei Avot, but also it's kind of subject matter. So the law taught, we're going to call it a law, taught in Pirkei Avot 6:3. Halomin michaviro perek echad, o halacha echad, o pasuk echad, o dibur echad, o afilu od echad, tzarich linhog bo chavod. One who learns from his fellow one chapter, one halacha, one verse, one word, even one letter, is obligated to treat him with honor. The halo dvarim kal v'chomer. And is this not a kal v'chomer? We learn this out through a kal v'chomer. Okay, here's our kal v'chomer. Ma David Melech Yisrael. David, king of Israel. Shelo lamad mi'achitofel ela shnei dvarim bilvad. Kara'o, Rabo, Alufo, Meyuda'o. If David, king of Israel, who learned from Achitofel no more than two things, nevertheless called him his master, his guide, his beloved friend, Kal v'chomer, halomin, that Kal v'chomer is not in here even. We're going to have an al achat kal v'chama at the end. I just added that in. Sorry. Okay. Kar'o rabo lufo miyudo, halomin mechaviro perek echad, o halacha echad, o pasuk echad, o dibur echad, o afilu od echad, al achat kal v'chama shetzarich linhog bo chavod. Then, in the case of one who learns from his fellow one chapter, one halacha, one verse, one word, or even one letter, all the more so is he under obligation to treat that teacher or that fellow, who is really his teacher, with honor. Okay, so our Kal is anyone, our Homer is King David, and in the case where King David did this for Achitofel, surely anyone, Kal v'chomer, should be doing it for Achitofel. Also, Kal v'chomer, it has like a tone of voice, Kal v'chomer, that you then can apply, and it actually helps with the reading. Okay, and just to say, like some of that like sing-songy stuff that goes into Talmud learning, it's a beautiful tool that is extremely traditional. And there are actually communities where all of Talmud, it's called to lein a Gemara, right? To sing it the same way you lein a pasuk or you lein a parsha. And the reason for that is that the sing-songy tune of certain types of Talmudic argument are actually so helpful in understanding what's happening as you're reading through the Talmud. And Kal v'chomer goes like this: Kal v'chomer. And now you've heard me say that. Listen when Rabbanit Michelle teaches, and you'll start to hear her and everyone else doing this as well. Okay, so right, King David showed honor to Achitophel. He's the Chomer. How much more so should you, Mr. Kal? This the lenient case. Any normal person on the street, should show kavod, should show honor and respect to anyone who's taught you anything. Because King David showed honor to Achitophel. Okay, that's example number one, Kal v'chomer. Here's a more kind of explicitly legal perspective. This is in Yoma 85b. For those of you, some of you learned this already in the DAF cycle, but if not, we're in the middle of, or if you don't remember what happens on Yoma 85b, even though you learned it like 3 years ago or whatever, we're in the Pikuach Nefesh Dochash Shabbat sugya here. So we're in all the arguments. The Gemara asks, how do we know that Pikuach Nefesh overrides Shabbat? And this is one. There's like many arguments that are brought. So this is just one of them, and I'm just cherry picked that so that we could see the Kal v'chomer. So Rabbi Elazar says, Ma mila. Shehi achad mi-248 ivarim shebe'adam dochat haShabbat, just as circumcision, which rectifies only one of the 248 limbs of the body. And by the way, right, circumcision was just in our parsha we read on Shabbat, the very first circumcision. The idea is that circumcision is healing, which I think is not many people's I don't know, like current orientation towards it, though it's certainly a medical procedure. But it's important to like actually take that in for a second, that circumcision is healing. Right. So Ma Mila, that just as Mila is only correcting one of the limbs of the whole body, and Mila overrides Shabbat, and we learn that internally to the Torah that Mila overrides Shabbat. I didn't bring in here how we learn that, just accept that for now. We can talk about that another time. Kal v'chomer l'chol gufo shedochet haShabbat. Kal v'chomer, saving a person's entire body, overrides Shabbat. In the English here, you have which is entirely involved in mitzvot. That's not in the Hebrew. That's like an interpolation. Sorry, I sometimes am better about taking that stuff out. I just take the English from Sefaria, and I should have taken that out. Okay, anyways, whatever. Right, so the idea is Kal is just one body part, Homer, whole body. If you can override Shabbat for a Kal, certainly you can, for the more lenient case, certainly you can override Shabbat for the more strict case, for the Homer, which would be saving the whole body. So that's our Kal v'chomer here, and it's quite straightforward. Okay. So Kal v'chomer, part of the reason why it's so foundational is that it's the only one of these principles that actually exists internally to the Torah, internally to like the 5 books of Moshe. So here's where we see it. Miriam gets leprosy because of her discussion with Aaron about Moshe, and Moshe is like, Hashem, Kal narafan Allah, right? Hashem, like, come on, heal her. This is not acceptable. And Hashem says to Moshe, Hashem says a Kal v'chomer. If her father spat in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? So let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days, and then let her be readmitted. So the Kal in this case is if a person was shamed by their father, how much more so if they're shamed by Hashem, right? That's the Chomer. So if you would have a certain punishment in the Kal case, certainly that punishment should carry over into the Chomer case. Okay, a punishment for a Kal for a lenient case should certainly carry over into a stricter case. All right, but here's the problem. And now we're going to introduce the principle of dayo. Dayo is short for dayo lavo min hadin lihiyot kenidon, which you see on the bottom line there. In our case, in the Torah's case, wouldn't you think that actually the Homer, if in the Kal, right, if you're shamed by your father, you should be embarrassed, you should be bear your shame for 7 days? The difference between your father and Hakadosh Baruch Hu shouldn't be like, yeah, so you get the same punishment for being shamed by Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Like, no, right? You should get 14 days. You should get 7 years. You should get a lifetime, right? Whatever it is, right? Like it seems crazy that the argument within this pasuk put forward by Hakadosh Baruch Hu is that you actually get the same punishment. Um, so the Gemara picks up on that, and it leads to this principle, which I mentioned before, Dayolo vomin hadin liyo kenidon. It suffices that a kal v'chomer deduction parallel what it is deduced from. It suffices that a kal v'chomer deduction parallel what it is deduced from. So this is, again, we're back in the Sifra in the Brights of Rabbi Ishmael. It asks this question and uses this exact question on our pasuk from Bamidbar to expound the rule of Dayo. Okay, we're gonna talk more about Dayo in a second, but Dayo is the principle by which Miriam only has to leave the camp for 7 days and not 14 days or 7 years. So again, principle of Dayo, the conclusion may contain nothing more than is found in the premise. It actually makes logical sense. So let's take a step away from Miriam's story and just make the following claim. If an elementary school child can do division in her head, kal v'chomer, an adult can do long division in her head. Well, okay, think about that for a second. Like, that doesn't make sense. We didn't say an elementary school kid can do long division inside of their head. And like I know a lot of adults, and I don't think the vast majority of them, right, unless there's some kind of like quant or consultant or whatever, can do long division in their heads. So but I can do, if you say to me like divide 4 by 2, I can do that type of division in my head, and so could an elementary school child. So that's where you start to see the principle of Dayo. What this example should state, in accordance with the principle of Dayo, would be if an elementary school child can do division in her head, that's our kal, then kal v'chomer, an adult can do division in her head. Now, you might say, oh, I know plenty of adults who are terrible at arithmetic too, and you might know plenty of kids in elementary school, by the way, who are terrible at arithmetic, and those might even go together. But but if you're going to make a claim that elementary school kids can do division in their heads, the end of that kal v'chomer to adults, where adults are the chomer, right? Adults are the stricter case and kids are the lenient case, is not that therefore adults should be able to do long division in their heads. Long division is a totally different category. So dayo lavo min hadin leo kenidon, that's our principle of dayo. The conclusion can contain nothing more than is found in the premise. So how does that play out, right? Let's say, oh, if like pickpocket who stole $5 gets this punishment, then someone who embezzled $1,000,000 should also only have to return $5. Like, no, of course not. Like, what that means is that kal v'chomer is not your operating principle in that time, or that kal v'chomer isn't working for you to get to the correct ruling, right? So even kal v'chomer, it doesn't always, it might land you in a place where that logically makes sense. But Dayo is a principle where you can land in trouble. It reflects how much trouble you can get into if you operate in a world that is only ruled by kal v'chomer, right? Because then you're like, oh, you embezzled $10 million. Cool. Well, I know that someone who pickpockets $5 has to pay up $5. So kal v'chomer, you should also have to pay up $5. Like, I don't think that really sounds like justice, you know? But that's the limit of kal v'chomer, and therefore you might need a different kal in that case. That would be one way to do it. You might need a totally different kind of ruling. Maybe the Torah has something to say, something different to say about people who embezzle $10 million than it does about people who pickpocket $5, right? Maybe there's different operational principles, and right? So it's not all just kal v'chomer. It's not kal v'chomer all the way down. And in fact, also, sometimes you can make a kal v'chomer, and it's just a bad kal v'chomer. And the Gemara itself has language for refuting kal v'chomer. So it's not the case, right? Even though wow, Kal V'chomer is the super foundational principle. Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah uses a Kal V'chomer, but that does not mean that every Kal V'chomer is perfect. And there are lots of ways to refute a Kal V'chomer. And that language that we sometimes see for that is Ikal Mefrach. Okay, so Ikal Mefrach means it can fall apart. Your Kal V'chomer can fall apart. And that's why I mentioned before this principle in Onshin Min Hadin, we don't punish based on Kal V'chomer. And part of the reason for that, there's a lot of reasons brought for that, but this is actually one of them. That Kal V'chomer, except for in the case of Hashem's Kal V'chomer vis-a-vis Miriam, is human logic, right? Most of the applications of Kal V'chomer were invented by humans, and sometimes humans can get it wrong, and that means that we're hesitant to render punishment based on a Kal V'chomer, for example, because this is still just human derivations, and so we are anxious about that. Okay, so let's just look at an example from within the Gemara where we're back in Yoma, but not anywhere near Pikuach Nefesh. We're talking about Malacha and Inui. So we have two different prohibitions on Yom Kippur. One is a prohibition on doing labor, the same type of labor as is prohibited on Shabbat, and one is a prohibition on affliction. And then affliction kind of breaks apart into many different kinds of affliction. But the Gemara first attempts a Kal V'chomer. Uma Inui she'ino noheg b'Shabbatot v'Yom Tov anush karet. Malacha she'noheget b'Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim lo kol shekin. Okay, so the argument here is that the inui, the requirement of affliction, is a kal, and the reason why it's a kal is that it's only practiced on Yom Kippur. It's not practiced every Shabbos, every Yom Tov. So that makes it a kal vis-a-vis malacha, which is prohibited every Shabbos, every Yom Tov. And if the punishment for violations of the requirements for affliction is karet, then certainly kal v'chomer. If that's the kal, if that punishment goes with the kal, then surely that punishment should go with the chomer as well, and you should get karet for doing melacha on Yom Kippur as well. Okay, the Gemara says, I'm not so convinced, because actually, says the Gemara, you could say that the Kal and Chomer in that matchup between affliction and a requirement to afflict and requirement to not do malacha, we just said, oh, affliction is the Kal and labor is the Chomer. The Gemara is now going to say, but it might be this. I'm not totally convinced. You haven't convinced me on which is the Kal and which is the Chomer. So the Gemara here says, Ika lemifrach. This comparison can be refuted. This comparison can come apart. Mala inui shelo hutar michlalo. Inui has no affliction, has no exceptions. Everyone, and I know you're probably saying in your head, what do you mean? What if you're pregnant? What if you're this? What if you're sick? What if you're da 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 da? Okay, just walk with me for a second. We're just going with the Gemara here. You can like turn off your like practical halacha brain for a moment on this conversation. So the Gemara here argues, Inui has no afflictions. Lo hutar miklalo. Inui has no exceptions. Wow. Inui is affliction. Inui has the requirement to afflict yourself on Yom Kippur. It has no exceptions. Tomar ben malacha shehutra miklala. And that is not the case for malacha, for prohibited labor, where you not only have exceptions, you have people who are required to do prohibited labor on Yom Kippur, i.e., the whole avoda, the whole worship service in the temple, right? If you're slaughtering the Seir LaHashem or whatever, then like surely you're doing malacha, and that is required. So in that case, the kal is the prohibition on labor because it has exceptions, and the chomer is the requirement of affliction, which has no exceptions. Okay, so you can leave aside all that whole conversation. Hold on, there are exceptions to affliction, blah blah. Some people have to eat on Yom Kippur. Okay, yes, I understand, but just focus on the logic for a second. The logic here is that you made a kal v'chomer at the outset and you wanted to learn something very serious from it, right? You wanted to imply a kari punishment. And also we just said we don't do punishments based on kal v'chomer, so you can hold that in your head. Also, this whole case is much more complicated, but just focus on the logic, right? We wanted to imply based on kal v'chomer some conclusion. The problem is if your kal and your chomer are mixed up, you cannot arrive at that conclusion. So a classic, one of the many igala mifrach times when there are grounds to refute, when your kal v'chomer can fall apart, is if I can actually argue that the thing you're calling a kal and the thing you're calling a chomer are in truth flipped, and then you cannot make the logic, because the logic requires learning from a kal to a chomer or a chomer to a kal in a specific direction, depending on what you're trying to prove. And you cannot do that if you're actually wrong about your categories. So we're going to wrap up with that idea that a kal v'chomer can come apart. One of the classic ways to do that is if you have misidentified your kal and your chomer. The Gemara has lots of arguments along this line, and the vocab that goes with that, sometimes, not always, is igala mifrach. And when you see it come along with other vocabulary, you might still see Rishonim, medieval commentators, talking about the refutation of a kal v'chomer. They'll still call it a pircha, which is that same word, igala mifrach, pircha. And so that's what we describe. That's the language we use to describe a kal v'chomer coming apart. Okay, on to the next. Gzera shava. Okay, so first of all, it's very unclear how to translate this term. So sometimes translators will literally just call it a gzera shava. My translation for gzera shava is gzera shava, which is extremely unhelpful. Unfortunately, all the classic translations are also not especially helpful. So Frank Dictionary suggests some possibilities: the same law, a comparison with the equal. Did that help you at all? A comparison with the equal, an equivalent form. So I think the reason why Koren in their translation don't use any of these, they favor a verbal analogy, is because none of those are helpful. And a part of the reason for that is that unlike kal v'chomer, where I can really give you strong, like if there's a rule about sneakers, then it has implications about the rule about snow boots, and we can all get behind that. And if you had a strong no shoes rule in your home, and then your kid marched their dirty, gross snow-covered boots through your home, you would be mad at them. Gzera shava is a little bit different. Gzera shava, it doesn't have that same kind of obviousness, and finding we're going to talk about this at the end, but finding ways to kind of use gzera shava in our day-to-day life as logic is much trickier. And okay, so here's what gzera shava is. When there are two passages in the Torah that contain the same grammatical root, word, or sometimes they're just synonyms, then the Gemara will apply, or the Midrash Halacha can apply a halacha derived from one passage to another. So Gzera Shava says, oh, there's this word here and this word here, and they're the same word, or they're synonymous, or they have the same root. We have created like a halacha wormhole between those two words. So when we have a halacha that appears over here, or that we know to be the case over here, we can imply it to over here. Now, probably already in your head, you're like, that is nuts. Let me tell you, it's not the case that every time we like see the word key in the Torah, we imply halachot from all the other places where the word key appears, right? And that's really like the core problem with Gzera Shava, is that it just seems a little bit like loosey-goosey. And the Gemara internally recognized that. So already within the Gemara, we have this principle: in Adam dan Gzera Shava me'atzmo. A person may not expound a Gzera Shava on their own. So all Gzera Shava learnings have to be inherited, which means as opposed to kal v'chomer, which any sage at any time, even up to today, can use and implement and form halachic logic with, Gzera Shava, the doors to Gzera Shava are closed. So you'll see it all over the Gemara. We had some recently in the daf, but you cannot say, oh, wow, I was learning the Parsha this week, and I decided that there's this new halacha based on a word that appears here in our Parsha and a word that appears in Sefer Dvarim, and in Dvarim, there's a clear halacha over there. Doop, I've created my own Gzera Shava wormhole, and now there's a new halacha in the world. Like, You definitely cannot do that. And no one has done that for 1,500 years or more. Okay. Even probably 2,000 years. Okay. So, but we have them all over the Gemara. So here's a few examples. This is from Hillel's like coming out story. So Psachim 66a. We're in Jerusalem and we have a question about bringing the Korban Pesach and no one knows the answer. Then they're like, oh, there's this guy named Hillel. Let's ask him. And he derives it. He actually brings a Kal V'chomer and a Gzera Shava. We're just gonna look at his Kal V'chomer. So here's, sorry, his Gzera Shava. So, but if you want, you can open Psachim 66a and practice your Kal V'chomer skills on Hillel's Kal V'chomer also. Okay, so he says, Ne'amar mo'ado b'Pasach, Ne'amar mo'ado b'Tamid. So the word mo'ado appears by the Korban Pesach, so that's our Bamidbar 9:2 case. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael ha'Pesach b'mo'ado. Let the Israelite people offer the Passover sacrifice at its set time, b'mo'ado. And it appears in the daily Korban Tamid and the daily sacrifice. Command the Israelite people, say to them, bring me my Korban Tamid. I don't want to get into what all of these words mean and how they fit together exactly. It's a quite complicated verse, but do it at its appointed time, at stated times. That's our moado here, okay? So then Hillel says, Ma moado ha'amur b'tamid dochet ha'shabbat. Just as moado, when it says about the Korban Tamid, the halacha there is that it pushes off Shabbat. Af moado ha'amur b'Pesach dochet et ha'shabbat. So too, its appointed time, which is stated with regard to Pesach, indicates that it overrides Shabbat. So we know that moado by Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat. And then we, through this verbal analogy to Korban Pesach, moado, moado, Gzera Shava wormhole, Pesach also overrides Shabbat. That's his argument. He doesn't actually use, and the quote that I brought here doesn't include the words Gzera Shava, but Hillel does describe this line of reasoning as a Gzera Shava. It does sound very similar, that like, especially that like ma, that just as, it sounds very similar to Kal V'chomer, but the core of the reasoning is word, wormhole between the words, not a kal and a chomer and a logical reason from one to the next. Okay, so the motor of this argument, even though the language, especially with that ma, sounds very similar to kal v'chomer, the motor of this argument is a gzera shava. All right, here's another one. This one is super important. If you got married, I got married using a ring, not the top one, the bottom one, this ring, okay? If you got married using a ring, or if you are some of the Sephardic communities, you got married using money, that is learned out through Gzera Shava. So if you are a Gzera Shava doubter, which I've had many students over time who are like, Gzera Shava is bonkers and I hate it. Okay, but you probably want to get married using money. And that is learned out in the beginning of Kiddushin from a Gzera Shava. So the Gemara asks, Kasaf Minalan, from where do we know that you can do Kiddushin with money? Gamar kicha miste Ephron. We learn out that Koren here adds in by means of a verbal analogy. It's not actually in the text itself of the Gemara, but they say it out that this is a Gzera Shava. Kicha miste Ephron. So this is coming up in the Parsha in a couple weeks. Taking with regards to the field of Ephron. Ktiv hacha, it says over here, i.e. by marriage, ki kach ish isha, when a man takes a woman, uktiv hatam, and it says over there in the purchasing of Marada Machpilah in the field of Ephron, natati kasef hasada kach mimani. Take it, I will give money for the field, take it from me. So just as, right, yikach and kach, so it's not the same word. It's not like we saw with moado where it was the same word. Here it's the same root, but between kach and kach, we create a halacha wormhole. And just as Marada Machpilah was able to be purchased with money, so too betrothal can transpire with money. And when the Gemara talks about it, the language the Gemara uses is kicha, is taken. Okay. Okay, so this is a not, there's all kinds of problems with my attempt at recreating Xera Shava in our world. And part of it is that this actually like works a little too well in Xera Shava. Like I don't want you to think that it's as elegant as this example. But just to give you like maybe like a taste at it, Rabbanit Michelle and I went back and forth about whether we should even include this because you'll be like too sympathetic to Xera Shava as a principle if you think that this is what it always looks like. But just as an example, right? Oh, assistant, when you prepare those folders, please put the pink and blue pages and a bookmark in each one. Okay, so now I've told you what the halacha of folders are. Okay, now next time when the word folders appears, I don't have to tell you again that I want the folder to have the pink and the blue and the bookmark, right? The implication is folder, folder implies the pink and the blue and the bookmark. All right, the problem is, right, in this back and forth, it sounds like it's obvious which folders I'm talking about and that it's making clear reference to the folders over there, which I gave you clear instruction for. And that's like not remotely how Xera Shava works, right? When Avram purchases Stay Ephron, it's not like he has in mind, oh, and you're going to keep this in mind for all time, that also betrothal, which doesn't seem to have anything to do in an obvious way with purchasing land in Hebron, will also work on the same principle. But for example, that's kind of the like if we wanted to give our best possible, my Leah Sarna's best possible logical read of like Xera Shava, this is what I got for you. Okay. I told you I was going to be finished already and I have a lot left to go. That's okay. We might skip some examples in Klal Uprat. Also, anyways, this was never designed to give you all the variations of Klal Uprat. But Klal Uprat is when you have words in the Torah, psukim in the Torah, verses in the Torah that have general principles and then also details. So sometimes you'll have just a general principle. So when the Torah just has a general principle, then great, the halacha is applied to everything relevant to that principle. And sometimes the Torah has just a detail. And when the Torah gives only one specific example, then the presumption is that the rule applies only to that example, unless you can use other hermeneutic tools like Kal Vachomer, etc., to expand it or apply it. But what happens in psukim where you have both general principles and specific details? So the rabbis implemented rules with regards to these types of psukim, and it depends on their structure. So when you have first a general principle and then a detail, a klal and then a prat, the rule is in beklal ela masha beprat. If a general class is written and then specific examples, the general class includes only the specific examples. So the general class gets limited by the details. But what happens in a case where you have a klal, uprat, uklal? You have a general principle and then a detail and then a general principle again. Well, in that case, the halacha is iatad dan ela ke'in haprat. You can infer items that are similar to the specific examples. So you're not limited to those specific examples, but it's limited to things that are similar to those specific examples. Okay, so we're going to skip this. I think that was clear enough. But let's go to the klal, uprat, uklal case. So we have our verse Shmos 22:8. We're talking about a case of guardianship where we suspect that the guardian stole the item. And then the guardian goes to maybe make a swear or a vow that he wasn't posha, he didn't like steal the item that he was supposed to be guarding. And then we have witnesses maybe that he was wrong. This is all into the Torah. I know it sounds like I'm like reciting to you from one of the bavas, but that all just happened within the verses in the Torah. None of that especially matters. What I want you to notice is that you have a klal, a kol davar pasha, in all charges of misappropriation. And then you have examples: an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, and then you have another klal, any other loss. So two klalim, two general terms, a misappropriation, any other loss. And in between those general terms, you have examples: shor, chamor, sas, salma. Okay, so in that case, where the Gemara goes here in Bava Kama 62b, and I'm not going to read it explicitly here, is it's going to take those examples and going to say, okay, what do all these examples have in common? Let's develop a principle. And then there are going to be things that are outside of that principle. So for example, property, karkaot. Does that seem similar to shor, chamor, sas, salma? No, it doesn't. Okay, so that's actually not included in the rules that are being put forward by this verse. Okay, so we have a principle, details a principle. What that teaches us is that we need a kind of a new principle that just encompasses those details. And then we get to, and then we can exclude things from what might have otherwise been included in the general rules, right? All charges of misappropriation, I can misappropriate your physical karka land property, but land is not similar to the examples in the pasuk, so it becomes excluded through the principle of klal uprat uklal. So just putting this into real life, for example, klal uprat, please put away the laundry. That's your klal, that's your general principle. Your shirt, pants, socks, underwear. Those are your pratim. So if I then said to you, based on that sentence, please put away the laundry, your shirt, pants, socks, underwear, do I need to put my hats away? Probably not. You didn't call that laundry. Okay, the prat comes to define the klal. Klal upratu klal, please put away the laundry. Your shirt, pants, socks, underwear, everything. Oh, so now the question is, are my hats similar to shirts, pants, socks, underwear? Probably yes, right? So in a klal uprat, no hat, klal upratu klal, yes hat, I think. Though I'm sure we could argue about it. That's the glory of all of it, right? So the Gemara would put forward one of these. They might then say, right? You could say, oh, it's a klal uprat. The next guy might come along and say, no, no, it's a klal upratu klal. I read the verse differently. Or they could say, I read a different category into this situation. Or they could say, okay, that's nice, but I approach this from a perspective of kal v'chomer, right? So there's a lot of different places that this can all go. And that's where we're heading kind of in next week and in the coming weeks also, our internal logic to the Gemara itself. And then in the third week here, we're going to be talking about evidentiary logic. So if someone comes in and makes a claim, not based on like a read of a pasuk, a claim about a thing that happened in real life, what is the logic that I might apply to that claim? So just some ways to put our learning to work for you in the week ahead. And if you, as I'm going through this, if you have questions, now would be a great time to put them into the chat. So for the week ahead, try to use the logic of kal v'chomer in your regular life, including the principle of dayo. So when you make a kal v'chomer argument about who should put the dishes away or whatever it is, use the principle or judge your argument against the principle of dayo. Okay. A. B, Gzera Shavai tried to argue is all about words picking up meaning in one context and then carrying that meaning with them into a different context. So again, we don't make new Gzera Shavas because of the weakness of that principle. But it is a powerful principle within the Gemara. Again, anyone here who got married with money or with a valuable item has put a Gzera Shava to work in a very, very, very important moment of their life. So when do you notice that a word can pick up meaning in one place and carry it along with it? And then also, when we use in our regular speech combinations of principles and details, notice how we imply the outcome that we have intended when we use principles and details in combination specifically with each other. All right, that is what I got for you. Let me figure out how to stop sharing. People can start to put questions into the chats. Okay, we have a sneakers and boots question to get us going. Good, I love it. Oh, hi, Rabbanit Michelle. Do you want to say anything?
Sure. I apologies for not making it in the beginning. I meant to and just messed something up, but I'm really excited to have this series go on because what I really wanted to say in the beginning was that I think there's a lot of challenges in learning Gemara, and there's different elements that are difficult. There's language, there's no punctuation, there's all sorts of elements that make it difficult for us to understand. And one of the main difficulties, in addition to all the others, is that there's a unique type of logic in the Gemara that's not necessarily the same type of logic that we use in everyday lives, although Rabbanit Leah did a fabulous job of bringing all sorts of, yes, parallels to our regular life and the logic. And I think that what's great about this course is that it's going to open our eyes into understanding the unique type of Gemara logic that there is, which you might already be familiar with, but of course, and what Rabbanit Leah has really been doing already is kind of focusing in on different types of logic, and each week will be a different element because there's lots of different types of logics. And so we're very excited, and this was great. Thank you, Roman.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll just do like a minute or two of questions. Maybe we'll only just have this one question, and that's great too. And then we'll finish exactly on time. Okay. So what Dr. Lilienthal puts forward here is, could there not be something inherently different between sneakers and boots? For example, used only in the winter versus used regularly. You could say also, right, a million options. Oh, but my snow boots, okay, you're calling them snow boots, but they've never seen snow. I live in Florida. They've never gone outside. Whatever it is. Yeah, so all of those types of questions are what we would call like ikal mifrach, right? That your kal vachomer can fall apart if your categories or your assignments are wrong. Oh, I called that a lenient case and a strict case. Oh, but viewed in this new scheme, the lenient and the strict is actually wrong. Or you can't really learn. They're actually just not in a relationship to each other. That's kind of where you're going with this question. Sneakers and boots are not the same. What if the rule that's under discussion is, should things have heels? So like, right, like to say like sneakers should not have heels and boots should yes have heels. Like there's not, but we're not talking about the same kind of thing. So why would you ever learn from one onto the other? It's irrelevant. So that's another version of an ikal mifrach type of argument to a kal vachomer, which is like, the two cases within a kal vachomer have to be in relationship with each other. You can't just be like, babies eat milk and Martians live on Mars. Now I can learn something between those two facts, right? Like kal vachomer, a driving principle is like they have to be related. And then, well, is my judgment of relationship the same as your judgment of relationship, right? I would say sneakers and boots are all in a footwear category, but you would say, well, they have nothing in common, and that's a reasonable argument that reasonable people could have. And so that's again getting at, on the one hand, like kal vachomer is our strongest, most foundational type of logic. Kadosh Baruch Hu himself uses it, and it has this inherent weakness because of the way human minds are, and that we might see things differently, we might categorize things differently. And the Gemara inherently has those anxieties about kal vachomer, exactly as you're suggesting. All right, I guess I was just so super perfectly clear today that people don't have questions. Well, if you think of questions in the meanwhile, you know how to find me, and you can bring them up next week. And so, Maggie, do you have any closing messages for people?
Um, I think that if you are a little confused, it's okay. That's important to say that it happens in Gemara learning. If you're a little confused, it's okay. The lesson is recorded. You can review it. You can also go back and learn the other Gemara classes that might give you a little better grounding. And we're so happy to see you here. We'll see you next week. Um, good night, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.